we did a 15-minute excursus on quote-unquote homosexuality in the Bible, because we ended up in Sodom and Gomorrah. And does anybody remember what we discovered was the actual theme of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? Hospitality. The story gets framed with Abraham's good hospitality. He's set up as a moral exemplar in the story. Like, he's there first. There is no other point to Abraham's hospitality being presented before the Sodom and Gomorrah tale other than to set the story up as a failure to be hospitable. Okay? This is how the Bible works. And so when we go in and we jump into a chapter and we say, see, God hates gay people because Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, we don't realize how stupid that is. I mean, you don't read any other literature that way. In no book would you just open to the middle and say, see, this is what it's about. And people say, oh yeah, but that's literature, it's fiction. Yeah, well, the Bible has some fiction in it. People, oh, you can't say that. Jesus told them parables. So you can say that, it's okay. And Jesus didn't invent the parable. He's a Jew, continuing Jewish tradition. That's right. Okay, this one usually gets people. Jesus was a Pharisee. Oh, I thought Jesus was against the Pharisees. No, Jesus argued with his schoolmates. Okay, and this isn't even like considered scandalous in biblical scholarship. That's considered like everybody knows that. You argue with your family. You don't argue with people that you don't have any connection with. And the way that Jewish schooling worked and still works is discussion and argument. Because you can't argue yourself out of being a Jew. You are one, and that's that. And so they'll just argue, and then they'll have a feast together. Because you're still a Jew. Right? And, oh, that guy believes this stupid thing and that stupid thing. Let's have Sukkot together. And they drink lots and lots of wine, and the kids drink wine too. And then they fight. And then they go back at it again, and they argue more. Right? But Jesus isn't like going after a school that he's not from, is what I'm getting at. Okay, he's not attacking some other school of thought. He doesn't go, hey, you stupid Sadducees. No, he goes after the Pharisees. Why? Because he is one. And he has a right to go after them. Like, that's a place where he's treading because he has the right to. He's been in their school. He's learned their ways. He knows their theology. I mean, we get this a little bit. Paul actually says, I was a Pharisee, right? But we get this a little bit because it's obvious that Jesus believes there is a resurrection. Whether he believes that he's going to resurrect or not is a huge discussion in historical Jesus studies, but it's obvious that he believes there is a resurrection. So that's a Pharisaic doctrine. Okay, the Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection, and all the corny Christians say that's why they were sad, you see, but that's not what that means.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. The best thing we could do is to end all the rhetoric against the Pharisees in the Bible, because we're actually having rhetoric against Jesus when we say that. Oh, that's painful for us grace people, isn't it? Because the Pharisees are like the epitome of evil. We're like, and that's where anti-Semitism starts in Christianity, is by putting Jesus against the Pharisees instead of recognizing him as a Pharisaic reformer of Judaism. Okay? That has nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. But I think that that's important to bring out on occasion, because a lot of times, a lot of people don't know that. And a lot of times when I'm reading, I read all these scholarly books and journal articles, and I take a lot of this stuff for granted, and I'm like, oh yeah, no problem, and I just read through, and then I say something to someone in conversation, and I realize it like, and they're like, what? Like, what are you saying here? Like, I'm saying that he was a Pharisee. Like, no, he can't be. Why is this even an issue? Like, and I don't realize that a lot of people aren't reading the kind of stuff that's available. And so there's this immense gap between biblical scholarship and the church. And it's filled by pastors and theologians. And that doesn't mean that they're all bad. Okay? It just means that there are a few, but most pastors are not also scholars. Because it requires too much work to do both. Amen. And that's true. And that's partially because the American idea of a pastor is stupid. And it's in no way what a biblical pastor is supposed to be. And we've lost that because the pastor hasn't been allowed to be a scholar. Okay, pastors can be scholars. There are a few. I mean, you know what? Theologians can be scholars, and there are a few, but a lot of them aren't. You know, and I have this thing that I say on Facebook a lot, and it really pisses a lot of people off, but I say theology is fan fiction. You know, and we know what fan fiction is. Fan fiction is a story based on another story, and it sparked something in your imagination that made you go write something. That's not bad. And it doesn't mean all the theology is false. It just means it's based on something else. And we have the story, and the problem is we're uncomfortable with the story. And so what we do is we write theology to comfort ourselves. We do. How many of us have a God, like in the end, after we've crafted our theology, how many of us have a God that we don't like certain aspects of? No? That's a pretty good indication that you've crafted a God in your own image. Because you're looking in a mirror and you're liking what you see. That's a hard one, isn't it? That makes you think. You start to listen, you're like, oh, like that's right. There are things about God that I just absolutely love that are like, uh-oh, that's more like me than it is him. I got to figure this out. And that's theology. And again, it's not wrong, it's not bad, but to me, it's like Dad, when we were kids, throwing all the books on his shelf away and just kind of going back to the Bible and saying, I don't really care about all these opinions. Okay, theology is a fancy word for opinion. And it's good to have good opinions. Baxter has a really good opinion about what's going on in the Bible, right? And Michael Harden has some good opinions about what's going on in the Bible. But there's also just the Bible. And we've been going through, and this is my segue into reading it. We've been going through and just actually reading the Bible. And I think all of us by now have seen a few things that internally are kind of like knocking against our theology. And we're like, wait, I don't like that. And it's like, well, it's okay. You don't have to like it. You also don't have to appropriate every piece of like writing that's in an extinct culture's annals into your own theology. And you also don't need to romanticize yourself into a text that is not written about you.
Yeah. There you go. There you go.
Let's let that one sink in for a couple seconds, because this is a big, big, big problem in the church. Marcus Borg, he's dead now, but he used to say, basically, what we have to remember about the Bible, it is, at every point, it is about their then, not our now. Yeah. And so they are writing about their own time. They are writing to people that exist in their own time. At no point did any author of the Bible think 3,000 years from now people will fight about this. They had no concept of 3,000 years from now. They believed Jesus was soon returning in the first century. So they didn't write for 2,000 years in the future. They wrote for their immediate audience. They believed he was returning. So everything in the New Testament has to be framed through the idea that these guys are not writing to us. Can we glean from that? Absolutely. Can you learn good moral examples from Shakespeare? Yes. You know, don't kill yourself waiting for love because maybe your families will stop fighting. I don't know if that's probably a good moral lesson to learn. No. We can still learn from them. We can still find guidance. You know, we can follow the Bible and let it lead us to wisdom. I said this on Facebook this week. The idea of following something, in the Western church, following usually means obey. Right? Like I'm just following Jesus. I'm following the Bible, and that what people mean is I'm obeying Jesus, I'm obeying the Bible, whatever. And really, it's like, no, you're not. And I think we've already seen that. You're not obeying the Bible. I promise you. You know, but also, follow means something else. It means letting something else lead.
Right.
Okay, and what is it leading us to? The Bible's meant to lead us to wisdom. This is the end point. Okay, and I know Christians like to say, oh no, the telos, the end point of the Bible is Jesus. And that, for Christian theology, that is true. That's why the New Testament exists. Because they believed Jesus was the end of all this. So they wrote the New Testament. But Christians shouldn't be the only ones allowed to read the Bible and get something coherent from it. If you have to be a Christian to open up the Hebrew Bible and get something coherent from it, that's Christian exceptionalism. Okay, and I can say it differently. If you have to have theology to open up the Bible and not be afraid of it, That's theological exceptionism. An atheist, an agnostic, someone who hates God should be able to find wisdom in the Bible, should be able to be led to wisdom. Because if they can't, then it doesn't lead any of us to that. Does that make sense? We're not even into the text yet. And this is important. Okay, is the flood story. We like to go back to this a lot because we've just read it. And is the purpose of the flood story to warn us that God will wipe us off the earth if we do something that makes him mad? No, but it does lead us to wisdom. And what is that wisdom? That violence will destroy things.
Yes.
And yeah, they attribute it to God, but really the cause of all this is Cain and Abel. I mean, it's Cain killed Abel, and then it just spirals. And they're very clear about that, right? And that's why we got to read Genesis 1-11 as the flood story. So we see everything that's going on. Well, we're doing the same thing with Sodom and Gomorrah. We have this hospitality, and even Lot is hospitable, or Lot, if you want to say it in Hebrew. You know, he's hospitable, and he's not really a righteous dude. He offers his daughters to the rapists. But because he's been hospitable, he gets rescued. So now tell me, is this story meant to be a historically factual story where God rewarded a man for offering his daughters up to be raped? No. But does it direct us to the wisdom of hospitality of strangers? Yes, because Paul continues that theme in the New Testament. You know, and so does Jesus. Be hospitable. Welcome the alien. That's in Leviticus. Welcome the alien. Like, that word means immigrant. Like, it doesn't mean someone who's coming to work. It doesn't mean someone who's coming legally. I mean, for all the stuff that people want to say, like, that word actually just means foreigner. Welcome them. Feed them, care for them, love them. Like, this is Leviticus. So Jesus didn't invent love your neighbor. He didn't invent love your enemy. God tells Naaman to go to Elijah and be healed while the Syrians are battling Israel. They're fighting, actively at war, and God's like, hey, you can get healed if you go to one of my prophets. What kind of leader does that? Oh, the one who heals the generals of the Roman army later on.
Yes.
Right, he's the same, yesterday, today, and forever. And so we end up with these stories that we don't know anything about because we've been terrified to go back at what we might find God is like. Chuck it. If I could call this like a class, I would call it reading the Bible without the obligation of belief. And I don't mean that you chuck out everything the Bible says. I mean you chuck your beliefs and read what it says. Our beliefs don't have to be formed by every jot and tittle that's in the text. Sometimes we have experiences that supersede all that. Anybody ever had an experience that's not in the Bible that you knew was God?
Yes.
Okay, this happens. You know, we don't need to be like in this self-contained little world. I'm serious about the Bible because it says what it says. And I've watched, you know, I was personally theologically damaged listening to other preachers, not my dad, but, you know, other guys who just kept trying to explain things away when they'd come to something that didn't line up with their theology. Oh, well, it doesn't really mean that here. Oh, well, it didn't really happen like that. Well, God had to do that to preserve the line. Like, maybe they're just writing stories, and we'd do better to look at what they're trying to point us to. Okay. Having said all that, let's get into not-so-righteous Lot. Everybody calls him righteous Lot. Ancient interpreters called him righteous Lot. Yeah, Peter did too, didn't he? He calls him righteous Lot. I mean, this is kind of a weird tradition for a guy who offers his daughters up to be raped. Or they define righteousness a little differently. And righteousness is defined by the hospitality that he showed the stranger. Maybe it's not in our actions. So we are only going to read 8 verses today, but there's a lot to do in these 8 verses. And from here on out, what we're doing is instead of doing a chapter each time, we're going to try and take a story chunk at a time. And the longer story chunks will break up, but this is a small story chunk. And it kind of is a weird little segue into Abraham and Abimelech, and it's the second time that he lies about Sarah being his sister and all this. And so we're just going to read this and break it down and talk about what happens in this little story. And we've talked about this before, that a lot of times there are things that we read in the Hebrew Bible that are etiologies, and that's their way of explaining how something has come to be. And there's also folk etymologies. And folk etymologies use Hebrew puns to explain why things are named what they're named. And so sometimes the characters are named something because the story is about that. And so in this particular story, Lot flees, right? He flees the city. Well, the word for flee in Hebrew is a pun on the name Lot. It's MLT is the consonants. And so LT is your name, and it's Milot or whatever, how they say it, and it's flee. And so this is kind of like a folk etymology well, they fled. What's his name? Fleer. I don't know. Lot. Let's just call him that. And so it's meant to say, hey, look, even though there is, and we'll show why, there is a historical kernel here, we're not supposed to read this as history. Okay? All right. So we are in, I'm sorry, Nathan, Genesis 19 and verse 30. And just, if you see mistakes in the translation stuff, I'm reading from, the Lexham English Bible, and I've noticed that there are actually some translation issues here too, in addition to them using Yahweh, but that's why I use it, so you see the difference between the name of the deity, Yahweh, and the word God that appear in the Bible. Because sometimes they attribute things to God, and sometimes they attribute things to Yahweh. And there's a time in Israel's history where those two aren't necessarily the same thing. They just come to be identified as the same thing later. Okay? So it says, and Lot went out from Zoar and settled in the hill country with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger one, our father is old, and there is no man in the land to come into us according to the manner of all the land. Come, let us give our father wine to drink, and let us lie with him, that we may secure descendants through our father. And they gave their father wine to drink that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, but he did not know when she lay down or when she got up. And it happened that the next day the firstborn said to the younger one, look, I laid with my father last night. Let us give him wine to drink also tonight, and then go lie with him, that we may secure descendants through our father. And they gave their father wine to drink again that night, and the younger got up and lay with him, but he did not know when she lay down or when she got up. And the 2 daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn gave birth to a son, and she called his name Moab. He is the father of Moab until this day. The name Moab in Hebrew means from the father. Moab. Okay, so it's like even that name, you see what's happening. This is a folk etymology, right? But it's also got a historical kernel. And we'll talk about why in a second. And the younger, she also gave birth to a son, and she called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites until this day. And Ben-Ami is like son of my people or something like that. These are names that both kind of imply incest, okay, and at least in Hebrew. And that's it. So you have this story. These 2 girls Lot's wife has become a pillar of salt. And we talked about, there's actually several explanations given for that by naturalist scholars, one of which is that she was vaporized by a flame and turned to ash. Another is that there are a ridge of salt formations in the southern Judean desert. The geography is bad for me. But anyways, and along this area, and there are formations that kind of come up out of the ground. And so this could also just be them explaining why these formations are there. And we don't like that, do we? That's like, oh, so you're saying Babe and the Blue Ox carved the Grand Canyon. I'm like, yep, that's what I'm saying. And it's like, well, okay, but you're telling a lie. Well, but we have a Grand Canyon. How'd it get there? What's your explanation? I'm serious. Like, is erosion. Can you prove that? Do you have multiple witnesses that can attest to the erosion over millions of years? No? So, sometimes we get caught up in our this is how things happen. And, that's neat, but you really can't prove it. And so, with a lot of things, we tend to, and I call it privileging the present. We tend to privilege the present in the fact that we can identify where things come from today because science. I mean, some. Okay. And the problem is we've gotten just as fundamentalist and just as committed to one reading of things with science as we did with religion, and we're in a new scientific dark age because we're being stupid about, if it can't be scientific, it can't happen. Well, I've seen healings. Get over it. And it's like you see things that are not definable by science. And that maybe they could measure it if they could find it. I tend to think that the reason God doesn't do miracles on YouTube is because it's YouTube. Well, God's not into fame. Say that again for the evangelicals. God's not into fame. Or for the worship leaders who make millions of dollars a year selling their idolatrous songs. That has nothing to do with Lot. It says a lot. So Lot leaves. His wife looks back because women don't listen. No, I'm totally kidding. She was told not to look back. I was joking. Yeah. No. She turns around and is immediately turned to a pillar of salt. That ought to kind of give us pause as to what they're actually trying to say there. Okay, she probably turned to ash, or it didn't happen, and this is a folk tale. People don't turn to salt, in other words. And then they go to Zoar. And Lot makes this big deal about staying in Zoar. Like, he asks the angel, he says, this is far enough away. Like, this will be fine for me. It's a little town. And again, Zoar's name means little, so it's kind of funny in Hebrew. And he's like begged to be there. And then like the end of the destruction comes and he's like, I can't stay here. Small towns are ridiculous. No, probably what's going on is, and we talked about this last time, is this destruction is most likely an earthquake, and it's continuing, and it's in his area too. And when an earthquake happens in an area where there's a lot of oil and natural gas and bitumen and tar pits, stuff can ignite. And Abraham, as he does in the story, could have gone up on a hill and looked down and seen the smoke rising up like a furnace. And anybody who saw that, who has no scientific anything, would have said, a God must have done this. Okay, so we don't have to throw the story out. We also don't have to say, but God didn't do that. It's not the point. It's asking the wrong question. And these are strange questions for me when we come to a text that is clearly not about whether or not God was the cause of all this, and ask a question about whether or not God was the cause of all this. Like, that's not the answer that the text is going toward. Okay, it's going toward the why. Why did the flood happen? Because violence. Why were Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? Because they were inhospitable, i.e. violent. Yeah. It continues. After the flood, what happens? The credits roll, and Samuel L. Jackson comes out, and he's the Avengers guy, right? And then all of a sudden, there's that Iron Man character. But it's the Tower of Babel, and it's like ... The violence has continued. And so we get into Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's still raging. And so what happens here? Why does God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Why is the question. Not does, but why? And when you live in a world where you have absolutely no data on moon affecting tides and high pressure and low pressure weather systems coming together and causing tornadoes and tectonic plates causing earthquakes, when you don't have that information, God did it. That's all you can say. So we don't need to look back at these guys and say, Israel just thought Yahweh was a punisher and that he was like, no, it's just they actually believed in him. Yeah. And we don't.
There you go.
Walter Brueggemann said one time, and he was talking about politics, but it applies to the way we interpret the Bible too. He says, the problem with my right-leaning friends is that they think that, I don't want to screw this up. They think that God's hands will do everything, and the problem with my left-leaning friends is that they think that God has no hands but theirs. Yeah. And it's like we don't let God be in between those two extremes, where it's he does everything or we do it all. Well, maybe there's some play there. Maybe the reason Jesus kind of straddles that line from time to time is because there is a line there. Right. And he goes over and he's like, hey, I know how to heal this. You live over here. You live over here, you're no earthly good. And I'm not trying to be dualistic and say there's two realms or anything like that. I'm just saying we know. There's just something else out there that you can access at times. Okay. So Lot flees. He's made this big case about why he needs to stay in Zoar and then leaves. It probably is like 19 at this time if he's doing that. And that was a joke. And it comes to the daughters. And we all look at this story and it's like, ooh, gross. Like, that's not right. And we know that Leviticus says that incest is punishable by death. Okay, so what does that tell us? This is most likely a true story because they said it anyways. Okay? And it's most likely before Leviticus was written.
There you go.
The story originates. They're not going to originate a story with incest in it where the guy isn't presented as evil after Leviticus is written. They're going to do that before. And same with like Deuteronomy and all the other, the laws in Exodus and stuff. So this is obviously a very old story. Okay, and the fact that there is no editorial comment that says that Lot, but he didn't do anything wrong. It doesn't say that. It just, he didn't know. That's the story. So the fact that they don't apologize for Lot's violation of Leviticus means it's earlier. Okay? So then we need to read closely. Verse 31. It says, and the firstborn daughter said to the younger one, our father is old, and there is no man in the land to come into us according to the manner of all the land. What a quirky way to speak. But the first part of that is what's important. Our father is old, and there is no man in the land. So that tells us what? The daughters thought that everybody had been exterminated. Which means what? They remembered the flood. They've seen extermination by God before. Okay, or they know the story at least. Okay, so their assumption is that because God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, everything is gone. And they're the only ones alive still. And so when we come into the story and we're like, ooh, it's incest, it's like actually what they're trying to do is repopulate the earth. Because they're like, God spared us for some reason. Okay. And then verse 32 says, come, let us give our father wine to drink and let us lie with him that we may secure descendants through our father. And I mean, this is normal. The primordial command is be fruitful and multiply. You must bear children. That command is what takes us through most of the sexual laws in all of the Bible. Okay? So we just have to be careful because if we're going to say that anything is hard, fast rule about sex in the Bible, then we have to say if it's not procreative. Uh-oh. Lots of things you can do that aren't procreative. And that, between opposite sex partners. And that doesn't even talk about this, so it's like we can't do that. But we can understand that their sexual laws are formed by that. Okay? So let's allow them to speak and not change their words, but also understand that we don't have to necessarily obey everything they did. Because they were extincted by the Assyrians. Wiped out. So, and it happened that the next day, So they gave their father wine to drink that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, but he did not know when she lay down or when she got up. So she got him so drunk that he passed out, is what this is saying. And again, this isn't an editorial insertion. This is just the story. So that means the story is old enough that they did somewhat try to protect the integrity of Lot in this, to say, well, he didn't necessarily do this willingly. But what's funny is that they also censored the daughters' names.
True. Yeah.
So all these kind of things tell us that people have been thinking about this passage for a long time.
Yeah.
And they've reworked it, and the original story probably had names in it. And to the Hebrew people, that's not a good thing to do, so they're just going to take their names out of the story without saying much else about them. Okay, so there's your editorial hand, but that means the story is still early. Anyways, So the next day, the firstborn says to the younger, look, I did this thing. Let's give him wine again. You go in and do it. And then they make this point again. But he did not know when she lay down or when she got up. Okay, and so the story is framed through Lot not knowing what's happening. Okay. Now, this is Nahum Sarna. He says, the 2 sons are born and nothing more is heard of Lot. That's kind of crazy, isn't it? Like, this is the end of his tale. And he never appears again in the Bible until Peter. And that's just in passing reference. His story ends on an inglorious and ironic note. At the beginning of the chapter, he was willing to let the virginity of his daughters be forcibly defiled without even informing them in order to save lives. Remember that? I mean, it's not that his daughters were standing there with him and saying, take us instead. Like, he was there out in front of the house with everyone inside and said, actually, why don't you just take my daughters? In order to save lives. Now, in order to maintain life, his daughters have lost their virginity by forcing themselves upon him without his knowledge. So it's a cool little turn where in the first part of the story, Lot was unjust in offering his daughters. And the way that the story gets him back is that happens to him by his daughters. Okay? So whether that's historical or not, it's brilliant the way it's written. Okay? Okay, so we're going to read, and I just brought this book today because he has all the sources in one place for me. So this is James Kugel, and he says, Lot's incestuous union with his daughters seemed to provide obvious grounds for condemning him. And this comes from Jubilees, which is, we don't have it in our Bible because we're heretics, and we don't read the Apocrypha. But we should read the Apocrypha. They were written, most of these books were written before the New Testament was written and are still very good. So this says, and Lot and his daughters committed sin upon the earth, such as had not been on the earth since the days of Adam till his time. For the man lay with his daughters, and behold, it was commanded and engraved concerning all his seed on the heavenly tablets, to remove them and root them out and execute judgment upon them like the judgment of Sodom, and to leave no seed of the man on the earth on the day of condemnation. Jubilees 16:8. So by the time that Jubilees is written, the author of Jubilees assumed that Lot had committed one of the most grievous sins ever known to man. But the Bible doesn't say that, does it? It actually says he didn't even know what happened. How can someone commit one of the most grievous sins ever if they didn't even know what they were doing? Probably weren't even awake to do it. Or like consent laws now in America say that if you're so drunk you don't know what's going on, you can't give proper consent. And I mean, I tend to agree with that. So Lot didn't sin, they raped him. How is that sin? Well, Jubilee says it is. So are we going to follow the Bible? Bible doesn't say it's sin, but the Bible does. Oops. We'll keep going. It is interesting, however, that some interpreters seized upon a detail in the biblical text to defend the daughter's actions. For when the daughters resolve to do this deed, it is because the older says to the younger, our father is old and there is not a man on the earth. And he explains what I explained. And then he says, but perhaps the expression not a man on earth meant more. And then these are all sources, and I'll give you the source first and then read their quote, okay? So the first is Philo, and we've read him, Questions and Answers in Genesis. He says, these virgins, because of their ignorance of external matters and because they saw those cities burned up together with all their inhabitants, supposed that the whole human race had been destroyed at the same time and that no one remained anywhere except the 3 of them. Okay, so that's Philo. He's an ancient interpreter, Jew before Jesus. He was a Greek and had a lot of questions about the Bible, and he answered them himself. And sometimes he's got some really good things to say, and sometimes his allegory is just silly. And that makes my Greek friends mad, but I think so. This is Josephus, who is a Jewish historian who also was a Greek writer and was more around Jesus' time. He was a little before Jesus, but was a contemporary of Jesus. He says, his maiden daughters, in the belief that the whole of humanity had perished, had intercourse with their father, taking care to elude detection. They acted thus to prevent the extinction of the race. Irenaeus, who's a church father, so he's after Jesus by a couple hundred years, He says, in keeping with their simplicity and innocence, these daughters imagined that all humanity had perished, just as the Sodomites had, and that the anger of God had descended upon the whole earth. Okay? So something's funny about, though, what they're saying here, and I don't think we're catching it. It seemed normal to them for people to assume that God's anger would consume the whole earth. They're not questioning that. Okay, so all these sources just assume, right or wrong, that people believed that the anger of God could consume the entire earth at once. Okay. They saw the fire. This is Origen, who is also a church father and one who a lot of people have issues with. They saw the fire, they saw the burning sulfur, they saw the destruction of everything, and they saw as well that their own mother had not been saved. Thus they imagined that there was taking place something similar to what had happened in the time of Noah, and that they had been left with their father alone to ensure the continuity of the human race. Basically, all these say the same thing. But I want to find one. This is Jerome. And Jerome was one of the first translators of the Bible, okay, or at least in our era. However, the justification that is offered for the daughters, namely that they thought the entire human race had been killed and for the reason lay with their father, still does not exculpate the father. So Jerome is saying, basically, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if they thought the world was gone. He had sex with his daughters, and he's a grievous sinner. And again, the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says he did not know. Okay, so we're starting to see what happens and how much of our own belief has been filtered down through ancient interpreters. Right? At least I did. When I first started reading this stuff, and like when you have to read it in Hebrew and you're a new Hebrew student, which I am, it takes forever to make it through a chapter. It's like 2-3 hours sometimes of work in a chapter just to read it, and that's not even really trying to do a good translation. Okay, and so you really have to focus on the stories. And I started looking at this, and I'm like, wait a second. It actually doesn't ever say that Lot did anything wrong. And yet, like, I've heard sermons on how Moab was cursed because of incest. And the Bible talks about this, and we're going to read some stuff that biblical interpreters say about Moab that is never in the Bible. Okay? It's never, like, even hinted at. In fact, in Deuteronomy, God tells the Israelites, don't mess with the Moabites or the Ammonites because their land is theirs forever. So God protects them in Deuteronomy, and we just read that it's like, no, you have to slaughter them all. That's Jubilees. So obviously the author of Jubilees is like, well, Deuteronomy can, I don't know a nice way to blank off. Like, there's not a nice one to put in front of that. Like, which expletive works here? Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go through, and we're almost done. This is going to be an earlier one. And I'm just going to show some of the stuff that is said about the Moabites in the Bible. Okay? First, and Nathan, you don't have to go to these. In Leviticus 21:18-20, we get this strange verse that says, no one who has a blemish shall draw near. No, one who is blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face or a limb too long, or one who has a broken foot or a broken hand, or a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man with a blemish in his eyes, or an itching disease, or scabs, or crushed testicles. What? Like, what a weird thing to throw in a list of skin diseases. Crushed? Is that like a problem? Are there a lot of people that have this issue? Is this like, are the medical clinics in ancient Israel full of men with crushed testicles? What are they doing to get that? Are you sitting on the grinding wheel a little too closely, or what's going on? No, but like, these are the questions that you need to ask. Like, how? How is this even such a big issue that it needs to be talked about? Like, oh, skin blemish. Okay, everybody's got blemishes. I get that. Like, no, okay, mangled hand. I get it. They're like, that's a visible, like, you know, that's a problem with some people, and especially if they're farmers and have been around animals a lot. Sometimes you get a mangled hand, but like, how? How does that happen? It's funny until you see what they did. Jerks. This is from Leviticus 22, so right next door to Leviticus 21. We see and it's verses 24-25, any animal that has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut, again, you shall not offer to the Lord. You shall not such you shall not do within your land, nor shall you accept any such animals from a foreigner to offer as food to your God. Does God eat? We'll talk about that when we talk about sacrifice later. Since they are mutilated with a blemish in them, they shall not be accepted in your behalf. Okay? And people are like, well, what's that? None of these verses say anything about the Moabites. I know. The next one's from Deuteronomy 23. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. The Bible can be dirty. And cut off doesn't mean cut off. It means forcibly removed. It means torn off. So this isn't even talking about eunuchs. This translation is biased toward eunuchs when they say cut off. It's forcibly removed. Okay, so this is like they're hinting at something. They're trying to hint at who this is, okay? Those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Can we list all of those who are born of illicit unions? Would incest count as an illicit union? Yes, it would. Shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Okay, the kahal in Hebrew. Or, I should not say that because it's probably a dot there and my Hebrew teacher's going to go, you idiot. But, this is not like you can't come into God's presence. It's like you can't even be one of his people. Okay, so it's not, the assembly is the group that's traveling with the tabernacle. Okay, and that's all of Israel. So it's not just like you can't come to church. It's like you can't be a Christian. Okay, if we interpret it stupidly. Okay, and then it says, even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. And that phrase does not mean, okay, the 11th generation is good. Even into the 10th generation means further than you can count.
Yeah, exactly.
Forever.
Yeah.
Ever they may not come into the assembly. Okay, so we've had all this stuff in Leviticus, we've got this in Deuteronomy, and it's all this like awkward, violent sexual language, and what the heck is going on here? And then verse 3 of this Deuteronomy passage, it clarifies for us who it is who has crushed testicles and forcibly removed penises. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even into the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Okay, so this is right away equating the Ammonites and the Moabites as those who have this issue. Okay, but why would they do that? Because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. They didn't show you hospitality. That's why Deuteronomy says they can't come in.
Wow.
We got to read it again. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is forcibly removed shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt. So what's it doing? It's not excluding them because they have this issue, and it's not really an issue, okay? This is polemic. But it's not excluding them because there's this issue. It's saying, you have this issue, and that's how I'm going to identify you from now on. Your identification is, what's the word for not able to perform? Yeah, impotent. Thank you. That's the identification of Moab in the Bible, in Deuteronomy. You're impotent. Nothing. And what's more, you don't get to go before Yahweh's assembly, ever. Okay, the next verse, down at the bottom of all this, says that Egypt, who killed them, abused them, and held them in slavery for 400 years, the third generation, they can come into the assembly. Yeah. Moab didn't feed you. Well, Egypt fed them. That's hospitable. They gave them homes. They clothed them. You see how big hospitality is in all this? I mean, this is a major, major issue. So then what we have in all of this, and I just proof texted the heck out of Moab in the Bible, and I shouldn't have done that, but I don't got time to exegete all these passages. But what we should see, and then finally, 4QMMT, which is one of the sectarian manuscripts that was found at the Dead Sea Scrolls, it calls the Moabites bastards, says that they have crushed testicles, and says that they have forcibly removed penises. And it says it very bluntly, this is the Moabites. And this is way, way, way further down the line. It was like closer to Jesus, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, and so for that tradition to carry that long, that's huge. This is thousands of years of polemic against one particular social group or race. You know, I mean, race is weird in the ancient world because it's not based how we would base it. It's more in the God that you worship and the nation that you're from than the color of your skin. And so, you know, there are black Israelites. Like, that shouldn't surprise us. And there are also white Israelites. And then there are also Middle Eastern Israelites. And that's because they all came from all over the place. But this is thousands of years against the Moabites. And then Ruth. Right? And then Ruth comes along, and the author of Ruth is like, excuse me, but to all the guys who have been saying all this stuff about the Moabites. Yes. And he's like, here's what actually happened. These people that you think are impotent sexually, have had crushed testicles, have had forcibly removed penises, can never enter the assembly of Yahweh, are now in the line of your king. Because of a sexual union. And we don't see that because we haven't been reading the story. We've been reading to see who God hates in Sodom and Gomorrah. Yes. Well, maybe the whole point of that story isn't who God hates. Maybe the whole point of that story is how hospitality gets framed, how a cry against an ancient culture got so great that God himself had to go down and visit it. And the author of this particular part of the Bible believes that this is what happens when the outcry against the nation gets so great, that God actually physically, personally comes on the scene to investigate. Okay? And then we have Lot, right? And so we've got this stuff that gets all woven together and stitched together, and there's all this hatred being built up, and it's not like they're not trying to do what we would do and be like just blatant racists with things. Okay, what they're trying to do is they're trying to give every single reason under the sun why Israel gets the land and no one else does. Okay? And so when you start to look at these origins of the cultures that they're at war with, and Moab is a cool one because Moab they fought with quite a bit. And there are writings from Moab. Have I read the one? I probably have. Anyways, the king of Moab, a guy named Mesha or however you say it, he wrote this big, well, I don't know if he wrote it, but it's supposed to be his writing. And it's this big stone ostraka thing that is a story of how he wiped out the Israelites during the rule of Omri. And it's like eerily close to the same kind of wording that Joshua uses when he's wiping out people. Like almost exactly the same wording. And it says things like, the deity, which is Chemosh for Moab, visited me, and he said, "O righteous king," and he's talking to the king of Moab. And he's like, do this, and you'll be righteous before me forever, and go down and destroy them. And Mesha says, and so I visited and destroyed the Israelites, and I killed them all, and they are not. Meaning, like, he wiped them out. Well, but I got an issue here because we have a Bible that has Israelites in it after Moab is known to have gone away. So obviously, the king of Moab did not wipe out the Israelites. Do we think that he's the only king who ever talked about wiping out another people group? No. Or the only ruler or leader or military guy, or the only time an author wrote a story about a king who utterly obliterated the opponent. I mean, like we say it today in the Super Bowl, like we killed him in the Super Bowl, right? And that's probably more what they're getting at. We obliterated them. We won. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily really mean that they're all gone. And we see it in Joshua with the Canaanites, and I mean all through Joshua. It's like, oh, they wiped these people out. And then like the next verse, oh, these people who are still in the land to this day. And it's like, wait, what happened? I don't get it. But we can bypass all that and go to Jesus, and he has a wedding at Cana, and then a Canaanite woman comes to him, and he's like, and people are like, oh, what's he say to the Canaanite woman? I'm like, wait, what is she? She's Canaanite. Oh, so Joshua didn't kill them all. What do we do with Moab? Moab can't come into the assembly of God forever. Ever. Not just 10 generations, ever. David's less than 10 generations from Ruth, by the way. And he lives in the assembly of God. He's a man after God's own heart, and he's a Moabite, and so is Jesus. Ouch. We don't we don't put all this together because, again, we're too afraid to read the story. Jesus is a Moabite. Jesus is actually, I think if we trace it all out, I'd have to do it, but Jesus is actually every excluded nation.
Yes, he is. Yes.
They get in there somehow, throughout the stories, they're in there. And it's oh, they're excluded, and he's okay. Right. They're still in me, literally. I think I have one more thing to read here. And then we can be done. Yeah, the last thing I was going to read actually was just the last verse of this Deuteronomy passage says, "You shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live." Ammonites and Moabites. Never. You shall never promote their welfare. So that means not only has Boaz done a bad thing by sleeping with a Moabite, he also did it, evangelicals, premaritally, but he also did it for her welfare and to secure her fortune, not to keep her from it. So, in every way, Ruth upsets all this rhetoric against the Moabites. And there are scholars oh, it's not a polemic against all that. That's neat. It might not be strictly written that way, but it sure does it. And that's what I call inspiration. Is when the Bible goes after its own exclusion. That's inspiration. And we don't have to get caught up in this whole I want to do what the Bible says. No, you really don't. Trust me. There's a scholar out there that has a book called I Dare You Not to Bore Me with the Bible, and I want to say that to people sometimes. I'm not being a jerk, I'm not being arrogant. Dad has probably read it through way more times than I have, but I've read it in more detail. And there are just things in there that no, you don't want to obey, ever. You don't want the little children, girls of the nations that we defeat in war to become your sex slave. That's a command too, it's not even an option. You take them. Is what it says. And every English version says, oh, and the young women. No. Young female children. And they're to become your slaves, your sex slaves. Okay? That you don't want to obey the Bible. What you want to do is let it lead you. And follow it to wisdom. Because it corrects itself. Repeatedly. Really, once you get out of the Pentateuch, everything else is about the Pentateuch. Okay, Genesis through Deuteronomy, maybe Joshua, but it's everything else reflects what's going on back here. And it's interpretations of what's going on back here. And do we all know that Hebrew prophecy is looking backward? Okay, it's not what we call prophecy today in the Bible would be called soothsaying. Or seeing a medium. They wouldn't have given psychic words. That's not how it works. They look back and they see what's happened and they say, okay, God is God. He is sovereign, not in the way that we think about it, but He is the sovereign. And so everything that happens under His watch. And so what they do is they look back at their lives and they say, what's been going on? What's been going on? Where has God's hand been? And then you get guys like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, because there's three of them, and Hosea and Malachi, and they're going and they're looking at the destruction that is behind them and saying, what happened? What have we done wrong? And Ezekiel is the worst with it. He's like, you people did everything wrong. You didn't do anything right. And Malachi says, or is it Micah, says that you know what you did. God required you to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. And it's not, so do that. It's you knew what you were supposed to do and you didn't. And so judgment. Okay? And I know we don't like that, and because we're grace people and we don't like a God who judges. But the story of the Bible is that one of the stories found in the Bible is that a formerly oppressed group can, and usually does, become the new oppressor. Right. Yep. And when this happens in the biblical text, the God of the new oppressor wipes them out. Because God does not like oppression, even when it's his people. And we don't like that. And we're like, oh, but God's not wrathful and judgmental, and that's theology. But the actual story is that Israel went from slavery to becoming oppressors. Yep. And so God said, and just wiped them out. And Ezekiel calls it the razor of Babylon. Like he's shaving you off at the root. You're done. Because you've become an oppressor. You were in slavery, and now you're an oppressor. And so, I mean, I don't like that theologically. I feel like if God was going to judge people, he would have, and maybe he did, and I don't know. But it's like Hitler. So there are things that we can say that help us philosophically move around these ideas a little bit. But the story remains the story. And the story shows this image of a God who chooses this people group and gives them all these rules and says like, hey, here's how you be just. And you love the alien and you care for your neighbor and yeah, there's a lot of weird laws in there too, but like those are packaged in there. And Israel isn't doing that. Okay? And yeah, they're being idolatrous. They're going out and they're saying, oh, he said he's the Lord our healer. Who is the healer God from Egypt? Let's worship that one instead. That's what Ezekiel says they're doing. He said he's the Lord our salvation. Let's go find the salvation God from Syria and worship that God instead. And so, I mean, there's some idolatry there. And Ezekiel thinks this is why they're wiped out. Okay? Is that why? Don't know. We can't know. We weren't there. We can't go back. And so what we have to say is, well, this is what Ezekiel thought. But we also have to disconnect and say, oh, the Bible is all... It's not. They don't agree. They think there are different reasons why. Jeremiah and Ezekiel disagree about the verse in Exodus where God commands child sacrifice. And we haven't gotten there yet, but in Exodus, God says the firstborn are all holy to me. And it says you need to offer the firstborn from among your cattle and from among your flocks and from among your children. And that's what it says. And the biblical interpreters, Jeremiah is like, never did it enter my mind that you would sacrifice your children to me. And this is Jeremiah making an interpretive move on Exodus, right? And then Ezekiel says, hey, the laws that I gave you were not good. And then he says, and I did it on purpose so that I could judge you when you followed them. Like, that's uncomfortable. But basically what Ezekiel's saying is, like, you knew what was right to do, and you didn't do it. And that's what Hosea says. That's what Micah says. You knew what was right. He's told you what was right. So he gave you these other laws so that you would follow him and be stupid, and then he could judge you. I mean, this is what Ezekiel's saying. And we don't like that, and that's uncomfortable. And it's like, wait, so there's laws in the Bible that, well, Ezekiel thought so. He thought that Israel should have known better than to even worry about that law.
Right. Absolutely right.
And he's like, you didn't know better, that you deserve to be judged. You're an idiot. And then they keep going with this. They keep going after, like, you offered your children to Molech? How evil can you be? And then we're like, oh, God puts his children in Molech's fire. No. Like, see, again, we don't know the story, and so we preach crap. Because theologically, it sells books, and it packs our churches. We could have a really full, church here. This place could be totally packed out if I would teach a series on the book of Revelation. Or Daniel, since I'm an Old Testament guy. And I went in and I started showing you how the Pope is the beast and how each, these world leaders are like the iron foot and it's like it's all garbage, but it would sell because sensationalism sells. That's why Jerry Springer was popular. Like at all points, I think, and this is encouragement for my parents and all you other pastors who have churches that have been successfully grown down. Being popular in a culture that popularizes the likes of the Kardashians is not something to go after. And that doesn't mean they're bad people. Gabby watches the shows. It's entertaining. But you're popular for being popular. And I'm sorry, but this is human nature. And we see it time and again, and we see it in the Bible, and it happens to Jesus. And people are like, oh, he's healing and feeding people. And then he says something that hits their theology, and they're like, see you later. And Jesus is like, fine, I'm going to go see this demon-possessed dude. He prefers the company and the safety of one demon-possessed man to 5,000 people who he just fed miraculously. Jesus knows the power of the crowd and what it can do. He's like, I fed you all. I gave you a good sermon. Everybody's happy. It's time to leave.
Yeah.
It's like, because it's about to turn. And he says, this demon-possessed dude is safer. I'm going to go see him. That ought to tell us something. But it also happens throughout the Old Testament. Every time the crowd gets together, give us a king! And people are like, and God says this isn't good. And every biblical scholar you know will say, oh, this isn't a good thing that they're saying give us a king. But that's what the crowd demands. I'm going to go off too far here if I keep going. Read the story. And read it slowly. And read it in multiple translations. And we don't do this here because you guys are all way more mature than most of the people that I know. And I'm being serious here, but don't criticize something that you don't read, and don't criticize something that you can't read. And it's like, it's not elitist to say that you can't criticize the Bible until you can read Hebrew. Because you're not criticizing the Bible, you're criticizing a translation. And all translation is interpretation. And so when you're reading English, you're reading someone else's interpretation, which is usually based on someone else's work. And yeah, and so we'll get into and then we fight about it. I'm baby Hebrew student. And I already know enough to know that most of what we read in our English Bibles is like a guess. There's some things, yeah, okay, pretty straightforward. But then you hit these words and it's and you go look them up. And even the scholarly dictionaries say, eh. And it's oh, good. So you have to just guess. And you have to assume that maybe the ancient interpreters were right when they translated a certain way. And so you go with them. But even that you're basing it on their work. You don't know the language. It's not a living language. You can't get into it and take it apart the way you can English. And so when we go at our Bible and we take the story and we read the story and we say, well, I don't like this part. I didn't like when Harry's parents died in the Harry Potter series. I hated it. I felt like, he could have been abandoned at the door of Hogwarts. He didn't have to have his parents be murdered. But you know what? It's part of the story. And it's actually formative to who he is. And it's formative to the whole story. And there's stuff in the Bible that is grotesque, and it says things we don't like, and it talks way too much about male private parts in the stuff we read today. But it's part of the story. And when we go through and we start ripping it out and rip it out and rip it out, and we wonder why we have anemic Christianity and anemic spirituality and faith surrounding our, nobody even knows what it says. And I mean, I really don't, I want to argue with people sometimes, and other times I don't, because I really think most people have more opinions about the text than they do time reading the text. And if we can dissociate ourselves from what Leonard Sweet calls versitis, where we need a chapter and verse for everything. Well, what does it say in this chapter and verse? It wasn't written that way. It was a scroll, and the entire thing was contained on one scroll with no breaking points. Where do you get off diving into the middle of a scroll that contains no clear marker and say, oh, well, this verse applies to me? Where have we been taught to do that? Well, probably by the church. Oh, every verse must be, but no. Jesus actually takes his disciples out. Let's just order lunch. Jesus actually takes his disciples out and shows them what? After the resurrection. What does he show them? Come on, you guys know this. Everywhere the text is about him. He doesn't say everywhere it's about them. He shows it where it's about him. He's like, hey guys, this isn't about you. Never has been. And yet today what we're doing is okay, now let's go find what we need to find in the Bible. And then again, Jesus comes to them, he says, hey, you search the scriptures daily because you think you can find life in them, but you cannot. And yet we're like, hey, if I read the scriptures, I will find life. That's not what it's about. You read the scriptures because you want to know the story. Period. Because the story leads us to wisdom, whether we're Jewish, Christian, atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, Satanist, whatever we are, we should be able to read the Bible and get wisdom. whatever particular religious tradition we observe. Because it doesn't say, like, even for evangelicals, right? The Bible doesn't say, thou shalt be a Christian and then go to heaven. No, like evangelicals believe that you have to confess the name of Jesus. But does confessing the name of Jesus make you a Christian? No. Observing Christianity makes you a Christian. And the guy who said, God will not dwell in temples made of human hands, did not start a religion that built a bunch of temples. Okay, so Christianity is a religion. It's not a bad religion. It's a religion. You can follow it if you want to. But just understand that one does not need to be a Christian to follow Jesus or to believe in Jesus or to read the story. Yeah, or to be like him, or to read the story and find hope, or to not be afraid of the story. You know, the reformers who taught that, God gave the law to abuse people so they would go looking for grace in the New Testament. Garbage. You know, I mean, every point of that statement is garbage. But it's there for wisdom. And we can find it if we will read it and not explain it. There's a scholar, I'm going to end with this, a scholar named Robert Alter who just released his own translation of the Bible. And he's got, idiosyncrasies in it like every translator does. But he does some cool things where he actually tries to bring out the puns that are being made. And so there's one in Isaiah where all the English Bibles say, I looked for justice and instead I found injustice. And that works for the English, but what is actually being said there in the Hebrew, he translates it, I looked for justice and instead I found jaundice. Because it gives you the little pun on the wordplay that's meant in the Hebrew. So anyways, his whole thing is based in his idea of what he calls the heresy of explanation. To where we read a text and we feel like we have to bring our theology, belief, whatever to it and try and explain it in light of that. And this is what I'm kind of trying to rail against now. Is this thing that we have to I don't need to take the Nicene Creed to Genesis to understand it. In fact, I shouldn't take it there. The Nicene Creed is thousands of years after Genesis. It's written in light of Genesis, but it doesn't summarize Genesis. I can't take it to Exodus. Okay, there are just theological points that we can't take into the Old Testament. Because otherwise, we start committing the sin of explanation. Well, why does it say this when we believe this? And really what we're saying is, why do I believe something against the Bible? And we're trying to justify to ourselves why we hold... It's okay. We all hold beliefs that rub against what some of the biblical texts say. All of us. You're not going to get away from it. If you believe in the resurrection, there are parts of the Bible that are pretty clearly talk about the fact that there isn't one. And this is a debate. It's not a doctrinal point in the Bible. Lots of the Bible is debate. Everything past the Pentateuch is debate. The New Testament is debate. There are some scholars that think at least one of the Gospels was written to debate Paul's vision of Jesus. Because it's Paul has this vision of Jesus. It's all-inclusive in grace, and Jesus is a Jew who still has some issues, is what the Gospel is kind of putting out. It's no. Jesus says that these people won't be into. Well, that's good Jewish rhetoric. But Paul said something different. They're arguing. Paul and Peter got in a fight. I opposed Peter to his face, is what Paul says. In Galatians, he's they're fighting. And they're brothers, because they're both Jews. They're not Christians. So it's okay. We can do this. We can make our way through it. We can debate it. We can ask questions. But at the end of the day, we're all still family. Right? Okay. All right, you're dismissed.